They gave the human the royal seal while the palace was still smoking, while ash fell through the crystal ceiling like black snow, while nobles stood in clean mourning robes and pretended they had not hidden in vaults while common children burned in the lower districts. Captain Elias Ward stood at the center of the throne hall with one sleeve torn away, one arm wrapped in a field bandage, his boots leaving red prints on white marble. And Queen Sarapha lifted the golden disk of Vera with both trembling hands, the seal that could open every gate. Command every guard, release every treasury, wake every ship, silence every court, and bind every noble oath. The Empire expected him to kneel, because every creature in the Orion crown knelt when the seal was offered. But Elias only looked at the gold, looked at the queen, then looked beyond her to the widows gathered behind the soldiers, and said no human had ever been offered the royal seal before. Not even as a token, not even as a joke whispered after wine. The seal belonged to bloodlines older than the palace moons. Two families who traced their names through wars, marriages, betrayals, and statues no one was allowed to touch. It was not merely a symbol. It was authority made small enough to fit in the palm. A sun-shaped key with the old crown etched on one side and the oath of service etched on the other. Nobles wore lesser copies on chains. Governors pressed them into wax. Admirals used them to open war docks. Judges used them to condemn worlds. Princes used them to make doors bow before they arrived. But the true royal seal had always remained with the throne, until the siege of Caldron, until a human captain ignored retreat orders, broke through Dominion lines, reopened the nursery tunnels, carried Prince Kalen out of a burning tower, and saved Queen Sarapha by dragging her through a drainage canal while she cursed him for touching royal skin. The court thought refusal meant ignorance, then insult, then madness. Lord Vennick of the Eastern Houses laughed first, because cowards often laugh before they understand danger. He said, "The earthborn animal does not know what he has been given." Princess Orlin turned so sharply her silver braids struck her armor, and half the court lowered their eyes because everyone had seen Elias carry her brother through smoke. Everyone had seen him hold the western stairs, and everyone knew the human had bled more for Vera in one night than Vennick had bled in 40 years of inherited courage. Elias did not answer the insult. He stepped closer to the queen, not to kneel, but to stand near enough that the old woman could hear him without the court hearing the break in her voice. "Your Majesty," he said, "if I take that as a reward, every dead person behind me becomes a decoration on my uniform. I will not wear them." That was when the nobles realized the human had not refused the seal because he misunderstood honor. He refused because he understood it too well. The queen lowered the seal a fraction. Her hands were thin, but not weak, and her eyes still carried enough winter to freeze a rebellion. "You saved my life, Captain Ward," she said. "You saved my heir. You saved this throne. The royal seal is not jewelry. It is a command. Name your place among us." Elias glanced at Princess Orlin. She stood beside the throne in half armor, her face pale beneath ash, pride and grief fighting across her features like two armies trapped in one field. She had begged him to leave Prince Kalen when the tower fell, because the heir was already gone. Because there were still thousands alive, Elias had carried him anyway. Not because dead princes mattered more than living workers, but because he knew a kingdom that abandoned its dead would soon learn to abandon everyone else. Orlin had not forgiven him for being right, but she had watched him refuse glory with the same stunned anger she had shown when he refused death. And then Elias asked the question that would ruin every noble in the room. What does the seal actually do? A murmur rolled through the court. The queen frowned, as if the answer should have been obvious. It authorizes the bearer to act in the name of the crown. Elias nodded once, politely, like a mechanic hearing a useless description from an owner who had never opened the engine. "No, Your Majesty," he said. "What systems does it touch? How many locks? How many vaults? How many ships? How many emergency overrides? How many records? How many oaths? How many hidden permissions?" Vennick scoffed. "This is not a tool chest, human." Elias looked at him then, and Vennick stopped smiling, because Elias had the calm expression of a man deciding whether a wall was load-bearing. "Everything that can open a door is a tool, my lord. Everything that can close one is a weapon. Queen Serapha should have ended the conversation there. Instead, perhaps from pride, perhaps from exhaustion, she answered. The seal touches crown gates. Archives, treasuries, tribunals, defense pylons, war docks, relief stores, broadcast spires, noble oath stones, and the great ledger of service, lesser seals answer to it. And every noble seal may be recalled, suspended, exposed, or broken under the royal seal. The court fell silent at exposed. Elias looked at the gold with the careful interest of a soldier who has found an unexploded mine in a nursery. He reached out, and every noble leaned forward, because they thought at last hunger had found him. Humans could refuse ceremony. Yes. Humans could make speeches. Yes. But no creature refused power twice, especially not a soldier with no land, no ancient name, no chair at the feast. Elias took the seal from the queen. The disk was warm, almost alive. Heavy with old law and older lies, it brightened at his touch, then dimmed, confused by a hand with no noble blood. No house gene, no Varan oath. A priest opened his mouth to object. But Elias turned the seal over, read the ancient words carved on the underside, and his ruined voice carried through the hall. Authority is burden, possession is theft, service is the only claim. He gave a tired laugh, not cruel, just sad. That is a good oath, he said. Shame what happened to it. Venick surged forward. That is enough. He cannot mock the foundation of the crown. Serapha lifted one finger, and the guards froze. But Elias had already placed the seal back on the queen's palm. He did not drop it, did not fling it, did not perform contempt. He returned it as if returning a loaded weapon to someone who might yet choose not to fire. I will not become a noble, he said. I will not be paid in obedience. I will not sign my name into a class that locked children out of shelter. But I will accept temporary custody for repair purposes. If the crown issues it in writing, repair, Orlin repeated, voice low. Elias nodded toward the shattered city visible through the broken throne windows. Your emergency systems are dead. Your relief stores are locked behind blood panels. Your evacuation ledgers list nobles before hospitals. Your oath stones still recognize traitors as loyal. Your seal is broken, princess. Not physically, morally. No blade could have cut the court more cleanly than that sentence. The queen's face hardened. And for a dangerous moment, she looked like the woman who had ordered rebellious moons starved into submission. Then a child coughed behind the honor guard, a little girl from the lower districts, carried into the hall because the infirmaries were full. Her hair had burned away on one side, and she clutched a cracked toy made from palace glass. The queen looked at the child, then at the seal. Then, at the nobles who had washed before coming to mourn. She understood, perhaps only for a moment. Perhaps only because grief had opened a door pride usually kept locked, Serapha said. Crown Scribe. Record emergency custodianship of the royal seal to Captain Elias Ward of Earth. Limited to restoration, relief, investigation, and defense of the realm by my blood and by the oath beneath it. The scribe went white. Venick whispered, This is unlawful, Elias said. Then write faster before it becomes necessary. The seal accepted him on the third attempt, not with song or lightning, but with a soft click that every person in the room felt behind the teeth. A ring of gold light crawled over his fingers, searching scars, measuring pulse, testing memory, and perhaps tasting the stubborn human habit of refusing to confuse rank with worth. Then the crown symbol rotated and reformed, not into House Serapha's crest, but into the old emergency mark that had not appeared in 800 years. A plain, open hand, court priests gasped. Orlin stepped down from the dais, and Queen Serapha gripped the arm of her throne. The open hand meant the seal no longer recognized ceremony as sufficient authority. It meant service law had awakened. It meant the throne itself had found the kingdom in distress and chosen not a blood heir, not a duke, not a priest, not an admiral, but the bleeding foreigner who had asked what doors still worked. Elias did not sleep, because humans are strange machines when guilt becomes fuel. He carried the seal not on a chain, not at his throat, Not where cameras could worship it, but in a battered engineer's pouch beside wire cutters. Sealant paste, a cracked data slate, and 3 ration bars. The first order he issued with it was not to an army, but to a warehouse door in the South Market. Relief Store 7, Crown Emergency Unlock. The door asked for noble blood. Elias pressed the seal to the plate and said, "Denied." The door asked for royal countersign. Elias said, "Open, or I remove you." The seal pulsed. The ancient lock considered the full weight of the crown, the oath, the emergency law, and one extremely impatient human holding a plasma saw, then opened. Inside were blankets, water pearls, med foam, grain bricks, pediatric respirators, and enough medicine to keep 3 districts alive. The officials responsible for withholding it arrived 10 minutes later and found Elias handing inventory control to bakery workers and street nurses. A minister shrieked that only certified relief stewards could distribute crown supplies. Elias asked where the stewards were. The minister looked toward the noble quarters sealed behind private shields. Elias nodded and pressed the royal seal to the warehouse ledger. All absentee relief stewards suspended for dereliction. Local civilian command recognized until crisis ends. The ledger flashed red, then gold, then accepted. A woman with soot on her face began to cry because her son needed lung gel, and suddenly law no longer stood between him and breathing. That was the first time the crowd saw the seal used without a trumpet, without a banner, without a noble receiving applause. It did not descend from a balcony. It did not bless anyone. It opened a door. And to people who had spent their lives dying politely before locked doors, that was more holy than any coronation at the Eastern Bridge. 6 evacuation barges floated half-empty behind blue shields because their ownership contracts required noble passengers before common transit. Thousands pressed against dock walls, while crews claimed regulation prevented mixed loading. Elias pressed the seal to the command pillar and said, "Crown priority override, living before lineage." The pillar rejected the phrase because no Varan had ever said it there before. Elias leaned closer, then learned it. The shields dropped, and instead of chaos, the crowd became a machine. Children first, wounded next, elders next. Anyone strong enough carrying supplies. And when Lord Venick arrived, demanding passage, Elias handed him a crate of bandages and assigned his house to medical loading. That image reached 12 worlds before Venick's sensors found it. The Third Order went to the Oathstones. And this was when fear truly entered the noble quarter. Vera had many lies, but none more profitable than the belief that noble seals were private instruments. A lord could seal a command, lock a vault, transfer land, call guards, or authorize evacuation. And unless another lord challenged him formally, the act vanished beneath family privilege. The royal seal, however, remembered everything. Every use of every lesser seal, every locked hospital gate, every diverted relief caravan, every private shield raised while public streets burned. Elias stood inside the Hall of Oaths with Princess Aureline, Mara Holt, his Terran demolitions chief, and Tavi, a 12-year-old palace runner who knew more secret corridors than the royal architects. The hall doors closed behind them. The stones woke. 100 black monoliths humming with ancestral law. The seal grew hot enough to burn Ilias's bandage. Aureline said, "Captain, some records may destabilize the realm." Elias gave her a look that made her feel young. "Your Highness, the realm is already destabilized. This just tells us who shook it." He pressed the seal to the central stone. Emergency audit, siege of Caldron, all noble seal actions. The hall answered with a sound like mountains grinding their teeth. Names filled the air in gold, then red, then black. House Venick. Private evacuation confirmed. House Terran. Relief convoy diversion confirmed. House Solvar. Security gate closure confirmed. House Ilrath. Military reserve withheld confirmed. House Orvath. External encrypted communication confirmed. Elias lifted his head at that one. External to whom? The stone resisted. Noble privacy law glowing like a locked fist. Elias placed his other hand on the seal and said, "Dead children outrank privacy. The seal flared white, and House Orvath's messages unfolded across the hall. The traitor was not hiding in the ruins, he was sitting in the council. Duke Orvath had sold the Western Shield schedule to the Core Dominion in exchange for governorship after conquest. His lesser seal had opened the first defense pylon, locked the nursery tunnel behind 200 children, and redirected the Queen's Guard toward a false breach while Dominion blades entered through the chapel wall. Orlin read the record once, then again, and her hand found the sword at her hip. Mara said several words. Varen translation beads refused to translate. Tavi whispered, "My sister was in Nursery East." Elias did not draw his weapon. He downloaded everything, duplicated it to 12 dead-drop crystals, and sent one to the public broadcast spire before the hall could seal itself again. Orlin stared at him. "You are not arresting him first." Elias said, "Princess, nobles survive arrests. They do not survive receipts." The broadcast exploded through Cauldron at dawn, not as a speech, not as an accusation delivered by a rival house, but as the raw memory of the seal itself. The people saw timestamps, gate orders, shield codes, relief diversions, private barges, broken oaths. They saw their suffering with signatures attached. And the city changed, not into a mob, though the nobles would later claim it did, not into chaos. Though the frightened always call accountability chaos, it changed into witnesses. Street cooks projected the records on smoke-blackened walls. Engineers copied them into repair logs. Nurses taped names beside triage tents. Dock workers painted House Vennick's medical assignment on cargo crates and in the lower district. Mothers of dead children stood before closed noble gates and did not shout. They simply held candles and read names until the guards inside began to weep. The royal seal had spent centuries making the powerful untouchable. In Ilias's hands, it made the untouchable visible. That was the hour the crown learned a terrifying truth. Humans do not need revenge to be dangerous. Sometimes they only need documentation. Orvath struck before noon, activating Dominion beacons inside the noble quarter. Black drop pods fell through the damaged shield. The Queen was seized beneath the cathedral, and 300 servants were trapped behind tribute vault because their masters had fled without releasing domestic access seals. Elias arrived with Orlin, Mara, Tavi, and a squad of Terran Marines, pressed the seal to the cathedral doors, and heard the wall refuse him under sanctity protocol. Elias looked at the screams inside, drew his plasma cutter, and said, "Then we worship differently." The wall fell inward. Humans entered first because humans are rude to death, fighting through smoke, pews, confession booths, polished offering bowls, and old servant stairs, until Orlin saw the collars on kitchen maids, child attendants, tutors, stable hands, and janitors packed behind the vault. Her face changed. Because knowing cruelty from a distance is one kind of sin, hearing metal scrape a child's throat is another. Elias pressed the seal to the vault, release household staff under crown protection. The vault demanded owner authorization. Orlin whispered, "Owners are not coming," Elias said. "No, Princess, they are," he activated. Recall. And across the city, every noble household mark tied to that vault tightened like a shackle. Demanding release or recording refusal, one by one, the authorizations flashed through. Not from mercy, but from terror. The vault opened, and an old woman slapped Orlin before realizing who she was. Orlin stopped the guards, bowed her head, and said, "You were right to strike. Help us get the children out." The princess became dangerous the moment she stopped defending the door. Orvath waited in the private star dock with Dominion commandos. Noble hostages, the bound queen, a cruiser, ready for launch, and a dead man switch linked to dock fuel, shield core, and chapel foundations. He smiled at Elias and demanded the seal. Elias did not posture. He placed the seal against the floor and asked for a dock maintenance query. Orvath frowned. "What are you doing?" Elias said, reading the room. He mapped old fuel channels, coolant, drains, foam valves, pressure doors, and one tiny fuel return gasket overdue for replacement by 32 years, because noble star docks, like noble consciences, were polished where guests looked and rotten where workers crawled. Then Elias used the royal seal to ask the least noble question it had ever received. "Where do you leak?" Mara fired through an East service grate. The foam valve ruptured, suppressant flooded the fuel channel. Orvath squeezed the dead man's switch, and the signal died with a pathetic click. Elias pressed harder. Crown override. Dock gravity inversion. Cargo class only. The cruiser slammed down. Commandos stumbled upward. Marines fired low. Orlin shot Orvath's hand. Mara broke his knee, and Queen Serapha, freed by a servant girl with bolt cutters, watched the traitor collapse. Everyone expected the human to demand execution. He had the right, by Varen law, by Terran anger, by the arithmetic of dead children, but Elias only touched the seal to Orvath's lesser crest. House Orvath authority suspended pending public tribunal. Assets frozen for relief and reconstruction, private communications open to audit. Hereditary privileges held in trust for victims. Orvath screamed louder at frozen assets than at the broken knee, and that told the room what kind of man he was. The Queen whispered, "You use mercy like a blade." Captain Elias looked exhausted. "No, Your Majesty, I use process like a stretcher. It carries what vengeance drops." And somewhere above them, the city kept burning. The core dominion had not come only for Orvath. His coup was the handle, not the knife. A second wave appeared beyond the broken shield. 6 cruisers and 1 siege carrier descending toward Cauldron's central spine. Their plan was simple. Strike while the court turned inward. Decapitate the crown. Broadcast Orvath as provisional governor and claim humanitarian stabilization over the ruins. Cauldron had minutes before orbital lances carved through hospitals. Bridge camps and the South Market relief lines Elias had opened. The defense pylons were damaged, their crews scattered, and most Admiralty SEALs were either offline or held by nobles too frightened to leave shelter. The Queen ordered the remaining fleet to respond, but command returned insufficient authorization. Half the war docks still recognized Venic priority delays. Solver maintenance exemptions, Ilrath reserve locks, and Orvath false readiness codes, the Empire's own privileges, had become enemy armor. Elias stood before the central defense pillar, bleeding through his bandage again, and asked the seal for total recall of lesser wartime permissions. The seal warned him, such action may collapse noble command continuity. Elias said, "Good," the pillar warned. "Fleet response requires ranked admirals." Elias looked around the room. The admirals were arguing over seniority, lineage, and whether damaged cruisers counted toward honor shares. Outside, civilians were carrying ammunition to pylon lifts. Dock welders were patching launch rails. Nurses were tagging evacuees by urgency. And street children were running messages faster than palace couriers. Elias pressed the seal to the pillar. Crown emergency. Recognize functional command by proximity and competence until Crown review. The pillar asked for definition of competence. Elias glanced at Mara, who grinned with soot on her teeth. "Anyone fixing something while being shot at," he said for the first time in Varan history. The war docks saluted mechanics. Across Cauldron, doors opened. Shipyards unlocked for weld crews, artillery towers, accepted retired gunners. Med shuttles launched under nurse authority. Food haulers received convoy clearance. Shield stations accepted street engineers who had kept illegal water pumps running for years. And the old carrier Crown of Morning woke under a maintenance crew that had not been permitted above deck during peacetime. Lord Venic tried to countermand the order from a private bunker. The Royal Seal responded by assigning him to pylon sandbag transport. Because his family seal showed 600 years of ceremonial military rank and 0 confirmed technical skills. His protest appeared briefly on public command channels, followed by Mara saying, "Put him on shovel detail." The seal marked it accepted, and millions heard the click. Orlin should have been horrified. Some part of her education screamed that hierarchy was civilization. But then the first defense pylon fired, guided by a retired dockwoman with 1 eye and no title. And the Dominion cruiser above it split open like a rotten fruit. That was the moment the lower districts stopped chanting Ilias's name and started chanting their own. The siege carrier descended through smoke at dusk, vast as a moving city, its gravity anchors opening over Cauldron's central spine. Defense pylons hammered its shields, but Orvath's sabotage had left blind sectors. On the command deck of the half-repaired Crown of Morning, Mara said, "We cannot punch through, not with what we have." Queen Serapha's voice came over the seal link. "Captain Ward, advise." It was the first time she had asked a human for counsel without hiding the request inside a command. Elias studied the carrier's path, then the old city grid, and saw something no noble admiral would have searched for. Because noble admirals studied warpaths, not garbage routes. Beneath Cauldron ran a dormant waste rail. A magnetic freight artery, once used to fire, refused to ward orbital recyclers, sealed for royal aesthetic reasons. Elias almost laughed, shameful still functional. 3 launch tunnels aligned with the carrier's belly, each packed with compacted metal refuse, broken parade frames, ceremonial armor too dented for display, and rejected monuments to dead lords. Mara leaned closer. "Are we about to shoot aristocratic garbage into a Dominion carrier?" Elias said, with Crown authorization. "Yes." 3 tunnels opened like the jaws of buried beasts. The first launch fired obsolete statues into the carrier's shield. The second fired 10,000 dented ceremonial breastplates. And the third, the masterpiece, hurled a kilometer-long freight slug made from rejected monuments, half-melted parade arches, and the huge gold-plated statue of King Villar the Pure, who had once outlawed public wells in favor of royal fountains. The slug struck the blind sector Elias marked, punched through the shield, entered the anchor bay, and turned 1 billion credits of Dominion engineering into screaming shrapnel. The carrier lurched sideways, gravity anchors misfired, and its descent dragged it away from the capital spine toward the empty salt flats. Keldron watched the invader fall, trailing fire and old noble faces. Mara whispered, "Art history has never been so useful." The city roared, not the court, not the army. The city and Elias, pale with blood loss, watched casualty lists rise instead of celebrating because humans were unbearable. They saved worlds and then counted the cost loud enough to spoil the songs. Elias collapsed after the last evacuation route turned green. When he awoke, it was not in the royal infirmary, though the Queen had ordered it. He'd woke in the South Market Clinic because he had apparently threatened to crawl there unconscious if moved elsewhere. At least that was what Mara told him, and Mara lied only when truth was less funny. His bandages were clean, his ribs hurt, and the royal seal sat in a metal bowl beside his cot. Wrapped in sterile cloth like a contaminated instrument, Orlin sat nearby, armor replaced by a plain gray field coat. Silver hair tied back without jewels, she looked older than she had 2 days before, which meant she looked almost honest. "You nearly died," she said. Elias blinked. "That happens." She frowned. "That is not an answer. It is a pattern," he said. She touched the bowl gently. "The seal obeyed you in ways it has never obeyed us." Elias looked at the ceiling canvas, where rainwater gathered in a sagging pocket. "Maybe it obeyed the oath. Not me." Orlin was quiet for a long time. Outside, workers shouted, children laughed weakly. Saws screamed, prayer bells rang, and somewhere a noble complained loudly enough to be assigned another crate. She said, "I was raised to believe the seal proved we were chosen." Elias turned his head toward her. "Chosen for what? To rule?" He closed his eyes. "There is the mistake, princess. A seal should not prove you are chosen to rule. It should prove you are required to answer." Orlin absorbed that like a wound, because some truths enter the body painfully. She thought of the servant collars, the nursery doors, the relief stores, the waste rails sealed for aesthetics while lower districts paid to move trash by hand. She had mistaken function for health, tradition for mercy, obedience for peace. The human had used the seal better than any noble because he had never believed it made him better than anyone. The tribunal began 4 days later in the shattered throne hall. Queen Serapha wanted it private at first, but Elias refused to attend unless the doors stayed open. The Queen reminded him he was not in command anymore, Elias agreed, then asked whether she wanted his evidence or his obedience. The doors stayed open, the People came through broadcast walls, street projections, clinic speakers, dock screens, and hand slates held by children who should have been in school, but now understood civic repair better than their tutors. The royal seal sat on a plain table beside casualty lists and receipts from every open storehouse. One by one, it spoke through records. Orvath's messages, Venek's evacuation delays, Terran's grain diversions, Solvar's locked clinics, Ilrath's unused reserves, and hundreds of crimes hidden beneath formal words like misallocated, reprioritized, delayed, transferred, preserved for strategic continuity. Elias translated every action into bodies. This gate trapped 900 civilians. This convoy cost 3 clinics antiseptic. This private launch consumed fuel assigned to hospital lifts. He did not shout, and that made it worse. Anger lets the guilty pretend the problem is tone. Calm numbers leave them nowhere to hide. Venek tried to defend himself by saying he had followed tradition. Elias said yes. The simplicity of that answer destroyed him. Venek had expected argument, nuance, a chance to explain that noble continuity preserved leadership. Elias gave him none of it. Yes, he said again. You followed tradition. That is why tradition is on trial too. The hall erupted. Nobles shouting that no foreign soldier could indict Varan civilization. Common citizens shouting back from screens. Priests calling for order. Guards glancing at Orlin because the queen had gone very still. Sarofa looked at the seal, at the open-hand mark still glowing faintly, and understood she was not watching a scandal. She was watching succession, not of blood, but of meaning. She struck the throne arm once. Silence fell. The queen said, "Continue, Captain Ward." That was the day the Empire's oldest word. Noble began to rot in public. The verdicts did not heal the city, but they stopped insulting the wound. Orvath lost his name, lands, command, and freedom. His assets became the Kaldron victims' trust. Venek was stripped of emergency authority and assigned 10 years to the Relief Corps under civilian supervision, which he considered worse than prison, houses Terran, Solvar. And Ilrath surrendered stores, ships, and private shields to public control. Servant collars were abolished by Queen's decree and then smashed in district squares by the people who had worn them. Blood priority in evacuations was outlawed, and the waste rail system, after centuries of shame, became a celebrated emergency launch network named by public vote. The winning name was the Noble Exit. Elias objected to the pun and was overruled by democracy. Orlin laughed when she told him, really laughed. The first unarmored sound he had heard from her, then came the ceremony. Because empires are addicted to ceremony, even when recovering from ceremony poisoning. The throne hall had no crystal ceiling now. Only open sky crossed by repair drones. Golden banners were gone, replaced by cloth from every district and white strips bearing names of the dead. Queen Sarafa stood without the high crown, wearing the smaller iron circlet used during famine courts. Beside her stood Orlin in a plain gray field coat. And beside the dais stood Elias in a borrowed formal jacket that Mara had threatened to set on fire if anyone called it handsome. The royal seal rested on a stone block, polished, repaired, and changed. The open hand remained beneath the crown. As if holding it up, Sarafa addressed the hall. Captain Elias Ward of Earth refused the royal seal when it was offered as elevation. He accepted it when it became responsibility by his hand. The seal served the people more faithfully than it has served the throne in generations. The crowd roared, Elias winced, and Orlin watched him carefully, because she already knew what came next. Sarafa lifted the seal. Captain Ward, the crown renews its offer. Not as decoration, not as purchase, but as recognition. Take the royal seal as first warden of the realm, a title above every house, answerable only to throne and oath. The Empire wanted a shape it understood, a hero made official, a human placed high enough that people could admire him without imitating him. Elias looked at the gold, at the faces of widows, at workers, soldiers, nurses, and nobles who had learned only which way history was moving. Then he refused the royal seal again. This time the silence was different. Not insulted, not confused, but afraid to misunderstand. Elias placed his hand over the seal without lifting it. "Your Majesty," he said, "I cannot be the proof that the system is repaired. If I become the only honest seal bearer, everyone gets to relax," the nobles say. "See? We honored the human," the crown says. "See? Reform has a face," the people say. "Maybe one good man can hold the doors open. And in 20 years, when that man is dead, tired, corrupted, replaced, or simply elsewhere, the doors close again. I did not use the seal better than nobles because I am human. I used it better because I did not think it belonged to me." Elias turned to the crowd. "Authority that depends on virtue is a hostage situation. You do not need better masters. You need fewer locked doors. You need systems that open when children are trapped. Ledgers that record when power is used. Ships that launch by need, not blood. Food stores that answer to hunger, not seals. Courts that cannot hide behind velvet, and a crown that treats refusal as warning. Not treason." He picked up the royal seal at last, held it flat on his palm, and for once let the cameras see it clearly. "I will not take this as title. I will use it one last time as custodian. With the Queen's permission, to change what it answers to." Seraphus's face tightened. "Because giving permission to be limited is the hardest command a ruler can issue." Orlin stepped forward before her mother could speak. On behalf of the heir, she said, "Granted." The Queen looked at her daughter, then at the city beyond the hall, and after a lifetime of being obeyed, chose to obey the oath beneath herself. "Granted." Elias pressed it to the stone block. "Royal emergency charter, permanent amendments. No relief store may deny crisis access by blood. Number evacuation vessel may prioritize lineage over injury, age, or exposure. All noble seal actions during emergencies recorded in public ledger within 1 hour. Servant ownership protocols abolished and unrecoverable. Private shield subject to civilian shelter override. Defense systems authorized to accept functional command when ranked command is absent. Compromised or obstructive, oath stones open to audit upon casualty threshold. And the royal seal itself to be held not by a single noble house, but by a rotating council of crown. District, fleet, clinic, labor, and civil witness. The seal flashed red at nearly every clause, resisting centuries of habit. Priests shouted that the oath could not be amended by crisis. Elias shouted back for the first time, "Then what is the oath for?" The words hit the hall harder than cannon fire. A thin line opened across the gold and everyone gasped, thinking the human had broken the monarchy. Perhaps he had, but not in the way they feared. Light poured from the crack, old, white, and clear. The carved crown lifted, separated, then settled back onto the open hand. Smaller now, no longer dominating it, the underside oath rewrote itself. Not in new language, but in the oldest form. The one predating dynasty's authority is burden, possession is theft. Service is the only claim, and service must be witnessed. The stone block beneath it accepted the charter, then transmitted it through every crown system still alive. Doors across Caldron clicked. Vaults changed permissions. Ships updated manifests. Oath stones opened public access lines, and in the noble quarter, thousands of private locks failed with a soft, beautiful sound like rain beginning. People did not cheer at first. They listened, because all over the city, doors were opening, weeks passed, then months. And Caldron rebuilt unevenly, loudly, stubbornly, which is the only honest way cities rebuild. The palace gained ramps where grand stairs had excluded stretchers. The South Market Clinic became a permanent hospital. The private Star Dock became a public evacuation hub. The cathedral wall Elias had cut through remained unrepaired by order of Princess Orlin, who installed a bronze plaque reading, "Sanctity Protocol reviewed here." Mara stole the first version because it was too polite and replaced it with one reading. Wall lost argument with humans. Tavi became chief inspector of emergency biscuits, an unofficial position that somehow acquired budget authority. Lord Vennick discovered that carrying supplies for 10 years gave a person excellent shoulders and very few friends willing to hear complaints about dignity. Queen Sarofa aged visibly, but not weakly. She held famine courts under the iron circlet more often than golden courts under crystal, and each time she glanced at the seal's new public ledger before issuing decrees. It was told in repair schools, in fleet academies, in clinics, in orphan halls, and eventually in noble nurseries, where embarrassed tutors tried to explain why their grandparents had been wrong. They said that once, after a city burned, a human was offered the royal seal of Vera, and he refused it not because he hated the crown, not because he lacked ambition, not because he feared power, but because he knew power accepted as reward becomes hunger. They said the queen gave it anyway as a tool, and the human used it to open food stores, free servants, expose traitors, wake ships, arm mechanics, launch trash at invaders, and make law answer the wounded. They said nobles had worn seals for centuries and used them to close doors, while the human carried one beside wire cutters and used it to open them. They said this was why Earth frightened tyrants, not because humans were stronger, though sometimes they were, not because humans were wiser, because often they were catastrophically not, but because humans carried a rude little instinct that asked, who is locked out, who profits? And what happens if I press this button, years later? When Princess Orlin became Queen Orlin under an open sky, Elias stood in the crowd, not on the dais, wearing a plain dark coat and the expression of a man hoping not to be noticed by history. The royal seal rested between the new queen and the witness council. No longer hers alone, no longer anyone's alone. When Orlin placed her hand upon it, the public ledger opened automatically, displaying the oath for every citizen to read. Authority is burden, possession is theft. Service is the only claim, and service must be witnessed. She looked directly at Elias then, across banners, cameras, soldiers, workers, nurses, children, former servants, and reformed nobles pretending they had always supported accountability. She did not thank him aloud, because he would have hated that. She simply turned to the first petition of her reign, a complaint from lower district engineers about floodlocks, and said, open them, not because he had won power, but because power had lost privacy, not because the royal seal had made him noble, but because he had made the royal seal useful. Not because he changed an empire alone, no human ever truly does, but because he had found the one place where a symbol touched machinery, law, fear, habit, and hunger, and he had pushed until the old world clicked open. And in the rebuilt city of Caldron, where children ran through gates that no longer asked for blood, where relief stores opened at the sound of alarms, where nobles learned to fear ledgers more than blades, and where the palace kept one broken cathedral wall as a reminder that mercy without access is only architecture. People still told the story of the human who refused the royal seal, then used it better than any noble, because he never once believed it was his.